Got a little PowerPoint presentation, just kind of looking at the history, some of the historical harvest strategies that have been employed here in Nevada. We might need to kill some lights and some of these commissioners. I don't know if you can see the board there or not.
Hey Charlie, would you grab this?
You can see from that angle, Daryl?
Yeah, I'll see it. I can see it. I'll get over close to my buddy. Yeah, me. This authorized one, left of your discretion.
Mule deer harvest. Basically what we're talking about, couple issues. Recreational pastime, somewhat of an American tradition. We're not going to really be talking about that aspect, but we're looking at harvest as a wildlife management tool, what Nevada has historically done, given different situations with our mule deer herds. Harvest as a wildlife management tool, we can increase, decrease population levels, increase and decrease population ratios, for example, buck to doe ratios, fawn to doe ratios. We can modify animal distribution, for example, to reduce private land conflicts. We do this all the time with depredation hunts. The trick with using harvest as a management tool is whether you look at it as reactive to the situation you have or proactive in terms of using your management strategies to affect a change in the population. What this graph shows is buck harvest from 1929 to 2003. This red line through here is a 10-year average, and it just kind of smooths it out. We're going to talk about several different harvest strategies that were employed over that period of time. We had aggressive, unlimited either sex harvest in the 1960s, specifically in the early 60s, 1961, 1962. In those 2 years, we harvested more antlerless animals than antlered animals. We had female harvest of 14,000 and 15,000 in those years. At the same time, we had buck harvest of 13 and 14 respectively. There was concern over competition with livestock. The deer numbers were so high, there was concern that range conditions could be affected by those high densities, and there was some pressure placed on the department to try to reduce those densities. Populations declined through the 60s into the mid-70s. The doe harvest was one of the factors that people pointed to as one of the causes of that decline. The director of the department at that time was Joe Greenlee. Joe's response was, why don't we set aside some areas where we continue to have the doe harvest, and we'll stop it in some select areas. So there were some areas where the antlerless harvest continued and some areas where it was stopped completely. Interestingly enough, the areas where the antlerless harvest was stopped completely not only continued to decline, but declined more rapidly than those areas where the doe harvest continued. Drought was the main culprit at that time. Livestock permittees also experienced some of the effects of that drought. There were millions and millions of acres of winter range and transitional range, bitterbrush and sagebrush, that were sprayed with an herbicide, 2,4-D, and then reseeded with crested wheatgrass. So at the same time that we lost millions of acres of transitional range and winter range, we had some significant fires, we had some significant drought. One thing that I would like to point out is that we had declines in our harvest and declines in our population, significant declines from approximately 1962 through the mid-70s, and the toxicants that were used for predator control weren't outlawed until 1972. So despite the fact that we had pretty aggressive predator control activities during this period, we still had precipitous declines in our populations and our harvest. we implemented a limited draw system and a bucks-only harvest in 1975. So we saw this decline, partly due to public pressure, but partly due to the agency's own realization. You have small populations, specifically in the western portion of the state. You have extremely limited pockets of habitat, aspen and serviceberry. In the east, they're more abundant. But if you have an unlimited harvest, you can easily go in and affect those populations. And as a matter of fact, at the time that the limited harvest was implemented, we had several areas where the buck ratios had been measured in the single digits. We had fewer than 10 bucks per 100 does in several of those smaller populations. Significant buck and doe harvest through the 1980s. A whole host of reasons led to this increase. We implemented the draw system, as we indicated here, 1975. We had record high fur prices in through here. We had exceptional precipitation. Again, a myriad of factors that probably facilitated this increase. During that time, we had very high buck harvest, and we also had fairly high doe harvest occurring at the same time. Then we got increasingly restrictive with our buck and doe harvest through the 1990s and to where we are today. This graph goes out to 2003. Last year's harvest was approximately 6,000. Buck harvest was 6,000, and it really hasn't changed a whole lot in terms of significant trends and patterns. If you can just imagine that coming out a little bit further. So 1988 was our peak harvest. Some people like to argue that 1988 was our all-time population high of 240,000 deer estimated. Our big game staff specialist at the time would argue that with anyone. However, if you talk to many of the people that were managers, the director at this time, former employees of the department at that time, their contention is there's no way there was as many deer here as there was here. However, we had exceptional levels of harvest, and if you running it through the model that we used at the time, certainly suggested that there could have been that many. So mule deer harvest strategies in Nevada today. Okay, we got increasingly restrictive with our buck harvest and increasingly restrictive with our doe harvest. Some of the justifications, some of what people tell us as far as the reasons behind these. A lot of these restrictive strategies and restrictive quotas are driven partly through the public process, social pressures. Some of the justifications are that we have no deer, therefore we must reduce mortality on deer to increase the size of the herd. If you were to ask just about any cross-section of society to identify the two most significant sources of mortality on deer, my guess is 90% of them would say predators and rifles or hunters. So the idea is that if we reduce our harvest, certainly there will be more. Another justification that's been made is, well, there aren't any bucks. I'm not seeing the bucks that I used to. So if we reduce our buck mortality, we'll have more bucks. Similarly, no big bucks. By allowing bucks to live longer through reduced harvest, they'll grow larger antlers. So those are some of the justifications, at least in the social arena, that the agency is provided in terms of justification of where harvest strategy should be. How can a restrictive buck harvest affect the population? Well, the effects are determined by the circumstances. And for example, talking about areas, especially in Washoe County, that might have been affected by unlimited harvest when you had buck ratios below 10, certainly you could see an immediate increase in your buck ratio, better age class distribution by limiting that harvest. However, if you're on the opposite end of that spectrum, if you're at buck ratio up into the 30s or 40s, you may see no measurable increase in buck ratio, or it might not be as significant or immediate as a change in buck ratio when that buck ratio is on the low end of the spectrum. Similarly with age class, if you have a young population because it's been overexploited through harvest, by limiting your buck harvest through restrictive quotas, you can see a better age distribution and a better spread of ages. Increase in buck ratios don't necessarily equate to increases in buck quality. Oftentimes they're inversely proportional when you're at the high end of a buck ratio. However, again, at the low end of that buck ratio, you may actually realize an increase in your quality. So it depends on where your population is. Restrictive buck harvest does not increase population size. And for example, 2006, 2007, and 2008 were the three highest postseason observed buck ratios on record at 32, 31, and 31. And I believe at least 2 of those 3 years we had a decrease in our population. Colorado concluded factors other than buck harvest are regulating productivity, and buck harvest is a quality hunting issue. How can restrictive antlerless harvest affect the population? Similar to buck harvest, if you have an overexploited population, if you have low numbers, and the habitat is in good condition, certainly by restricting your antlerless harvest, you would expect to see a positive response in that population. A lot of it has to do with that population size as it relates back to the habitat and the carrying capacity. Again, if you're at or near a carrying capacity, if you don't have the nutrients for that population to grow, that harvest won't necessarily result in an increase in the population, which is what the next point says. Decrease in doe harvest doesn't necessarily equate to an increase in the population. Restrictive doe harvest at maximum sustainable density may decrease your population. By maximum sustainable density, that's just basically saying that a population that is at carrying capacity, at a population that cannot sustain more animals, if you restrict your antlerless harvest, you may increase the competition occurring between those animals, decrease production, decrease animal condition, body condition, and consequently may increase overwinter losses or other losses. Restrictive doe harvest at maximum sustainable density may decrease buck quality also. And that's through competition. If you have more animals competing for the extant forage, it can manifest itself in decreased body condition, which can relate to the quality of the antlers. So a take-home message regarding buck harvest strategies. Buck harvest is not a factor affecting deer production and should be regarded as an issue of quality hunting. However, the highest observed statewide buck ratios on record occurred in 06, 07, and 08, and no indication of improved quality exists. Buck ratios from 1982 to 1992 averaged 24, and 82 to 92 was considered by many to be the heyday of Nevada in terms of abundance and quality. Take-home message regarding antlerless harvest strategies. One of the most confusing concepts in population management is that fewer deer can produce more fawns. That's a quote that I took from Rangelands publication from the Society of Range Management. The mathematical example that they used was that if you, for example, look at 100 does that may be producing 20 to 30 fawns, you could produce more fawns with 50 does in better condition if they're producing at a ratio of perhaps 60 fawns per 100. So you could actually make more fawns, actually have higher production and higher recruitment with fewer deer. One study showed that average dressed weights increased by 20 pounds over 7 years in response to a sustained doe hunt. During this same time period, trophy buck harvest doubled. One of the things that's been interesting, listening to some of the historical experts associated that have come in and talked to the Mule Deer Restoration Committee, Cliff Gardner in particular, who's been in Ruby Valley all of his life, it talks about how much bigger the deer used to be, how they used to be so much heavier. And I think that people would also argue that they used to see a little better antler quality. And I think those are potential indications of populations that are struggling with quality of habitat. Another study showed that doe harvest resulted in higher buck harvest and improve buck quality. And again, that goes back to production. If you have higher production and higher recruitment into a population, presumably you can take more from it. Also, you're reducing the competition, so your buck quality can be allowed to increase. Just as kind of an example, I know there was a pretty contentious issue last year, and it's been discussed repeatedly over the last year, was the 2009 Area 10 antlerless hunt. There was 987 tags that were approved by the commission roughly this weekend last year by a 7-to-1 vote. That 987 tags equated to 4% of the population estimate at the time, which was 24,000. Approximately 50% of the hunters were successful, and 490 does were harvested, which is roughly 2% of the population estimate. Of the 490 does harvested, NDOW received 150 sets of samples. And when I say sets of samples, we had approximately 10 samples per animal that we were attempting to collect. They included age from the animals, tissue samples for DNA, hair samples for mineral analysis, CWD samples, body condition indices that included a heart to assess condition of the heart in terms of fat accumulation, kidney for the same reason, rump fat measures, fecal samples, so that we can look at those animals and try to determine if they do demonstrate perhaps a limitation by habitat. We can look at the age class of the population, the distribution of ages. And I just this morning received the age analysis on those teeth. It was emailed to me. I haven't had an opportunity to analyze it, but perhaps at some point, if the commission desires, I'd be more than happy to present the results from those findings. 2009 to 2010, this population shows a 6% increase in the population size. I'm not suggesting that that increase is a result of that harvest. However, I am demonstrating that 2% reduction of the does wasn't sufficient to make that population decline or shrink. In any way, this is a little video clip that we got about 60 days ago in Area 10. Took a camera up into the helicopter along with spring deer surveys. This is on Harrison Pass. Just to kind of give you an idea of what some of the deer numbers look like in this area and what their condition is in the spring. As we go through these, basically what we're doing is classifying. We wouldn't try to classify a group this size all at once, but we would try to break off smaller groups, classifying adults and fawns. Obviously, the bucks don't have antlers at this time of year, so it's just a matter of trying to determine overwinter survival on the fawns. And again, this is immediately north of Harrison Pass. It's some of the highest density winter range anywhere in the West. It's not uncommon to find 5,000 to 6,000 deer transitioning through here. Oftentimes, we're surveying in excess of 1,000 deer, classifying in excess of 1,000 deer an hour out here. There's also sage grouse in this area. we had a pilot that started flying with us about 10 years ago, and he came to Nevada via Alaska, and he made a couple comments. First comment he asked was if the area was closed to hunting, and the second one was that he thought they looked like caribou moving across the Arctic tundra in there. There's such high density. So if we look at the history, if we look at buck harvest as a percent of the statewide population estimate, so this is independent of buck ratios, all we're looking at is male harvest expressed as a percent of the statewide population estimate. We're looking at generally a declining trend. In 1985, we harvested the highest percentage of our statewide population estimate as bucks. We took 11% of our statewide population estimate was bucks. And at the same time, our buck ratio was 24. So we were taking a much higher bite of our bucks here than when we would even if we were shooting 11% of our population estimate now, because our buck ratio is so much higher now. If we look at our statewide postseason observed buck ratios from 1983 to 2009, we're seeing those buck ratios continue to climb and climb and climb. Observed postseason buck ratio, the highest was 2006. This is 32. I know that at least one hunt unit in the state this year is coming in with a recommendation of 41. Again, compare that 1985, 83, 84, 85 at 23, 24, 25. The statewide fall fawn to doe ratio, and again this is an observed value, has been decreasing steadily from 1974 to 2010. So even though we had phenomenal growth from the time that we implemented our limited draw system in 75 up to 89, 88, 89, 90, somewhere in here, we're seeing potential evidence of density dependence. As those numbers are growing and growing and growing, we're seeing fewer and fewer fawns being produced. And we continue with that trend, having almost one of the lowest years we've seen in fall, fawn recruitment back in 07. So it's basically the history. I think what the county advisory boards have seen and what we'll be discussing tomorrow is generally a limited doe harvest. I believe there's only 4 areas where an antlerless harvest even exists with respect to mule deer at any rate. I think the department has made a very limited, very conservative recommendation, at least until body condition data indicates otherwise. Extremely conservative buck harvest quotas with postseason buck ratio objectives in the 30s, and as I indicated, there's at least one area that's in the 40s compared to 23 to 24 through the mid 1980s. That's my quick and dirty history of harvest strategies in Nevada.
Turn the lights.
It's the camera.
It's got the lights. Thank you, Tony. Commissioner have any questions? Commissioner Moore.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have one question, Tony, on the, I know last year you stated that you had 9 different collections or things that you were looking at out of your doe harvest. Do you plan on implementing that same procedure if the doe seasons or the quotas are approved at the levels that are recommended? Do you plan on collecting the same data that you did last year?
Well, of the 987 tags and 490 successful hunters, we ended up with somewhere in the neighborhood of 140 to 150 samples. So we had 50% hunter success and about 30% voluntary compliance that was incentivized with a raffle donated by Mule Deer Foundation. So if you look at this year's department recommended quota, which is somewhere in the neighborhood of 240, and you extrapolate that out to 50% hunter success and 30% voluntary compliance without an incentivized program, my guess is that it would be a really small sample. What I would like to do with the mule deer program is begin to look at some of our populations more analytically, look at body condition. If we go into an area that we know has low fawn recruitment, low fawn production, but excellent body condition, then that tells us right there that perhaps we have a predator problem in that area. That's the kind of evidence that we need to identify what's limiting these populations. If we have good age class distribution and good body condition, however the population can't produce, then that means there's another source of mortality out there. So I guess that doesn't answer your question, but I think that we need to look at all of our areas a little bit more analytically and take advantage of the opportunity. We heard yesterday with some of the heritage proposals, there's at least one proposal for an ultrasound machine where you can assess body condition of live animals. You can also determine fetal rates, if an animal's pregnant, if it's carrying twins. So I think the department should be more proactive in that regard and try to learn as much as we can about these populations so that we know what's limiting those populations that aren't growing, and then try to address that.
One other thing that I'd like to add is I had the opportunity to go on a flight in Area 6 to classify mule deer. And the video that you showed looked similar to what I saw in certain areas of Area 6 with large bunches of deer, 300 to 400 in a bunch, the same way as you showed us on the video.
Area
I was
6
really surprised to see that.
Yeah, Area 6 is it's a unique area in that it has, as you know, incredible summer range. The Independence Range is so well watered, has ideal mule deer forage species scattered throughout. So in a year like this year where we had a relatively mild winter, Area 6 grew 12% was the population increase in Area 6. So you have great summer range. Area 6 has traditionally produced 10 fawns per 100 does, more than any other area in the state. It's by far the most productive area.
Tony? I noticed that when you were talking here that, you were talking about the chief of the game bureau was total disagreement with the biologist when the peak years hit, stuff like that. So there sounds like there is some controversy even among the experts on some of these issues, right?
The controversy may be whether it was 220,000 or 240, whether we had the most deer in 1988 or if we had the most deer in 1962. The issues that are not issues of debate are that we peaked. We had 2 mule deer peaks in Nevada, one approximately 1960, one approximately 1988, and we had a significant decline into the mid-70s.
And the other thing I might suggest is on your slide there, you quoted on many of the slides you quoted studies, and it'd be nice for us to have a footnote on there so we can see the authority quoted to evaluate whether it's a valid scientific study, because somebody says something, I'd like to look at the study to see if it's a valid study, so by footnoting the study, at least would have an idea.
Can I provide you with the papers? I can get a copy for each commissioner, provide you with those papers
I'll
before.
talk to them later and get a CD. I'd like to look at some of those studies, and there was no footnote on them, because I've seen studies that are published that, just people put their name out and they don't have any validity, and then other people pick up on them, and that happens.
I sure do. I see that quite frequently.
And, they're really not a good authoritative source when people use them. And I'm not saying you weren't, but it'd be nice to be able to go back and look at some of those.
Yeah, I'd like to provide the commission with a copy of those.
Yeah, thank you.
You bet.
Commissioner Ray.
Mr. Wasley, would it be fair to state, something that's come up about the perceived difference, possible difference between the 60s and the 80s? There was a change over those couple decades, 70s, the 80s, with the more modern style of modeling and surveying processes that happened over that 20-something year, and that there's a lot of speculating that may or may not have had some effect upon those perceptions of levels. I mean, is that relatively?
I don't know
I mean,
if I understand your question.
A lot of the controversy about some people claiming that the 60s had better population, others claiming the 80s, and yet Endow's models. But then the way Endow came up with those numbers was very different in the 60s than the way they came up with those numbers in the 80s. And it might be a difference in those methodologies.
There certainly could be. The biologists in the 60s did a lot of pellet counts and did a lot of track counts. But when you had unlimited harvest, the population of the state wasn't nearly what it is now. So you may have actually had much higher harvest given the population that we had, for example, in the mid to late 80s. We had a lot more demand, a lot more interest in what we were producing. There's been a number of different population estimation methodologies used around the West, and that's changed through time within each state, as it has in Nevada. For example, after we did the pellet counts and the track counts, and then we used the B1, and then from the B1 we went to the Jet Ranger. We've used a change in ratio model, we've used a POP2 model, we've used a spreadsheet model, and there's quite a bit of discussion amongst biologists about the strengths and weaknesses of each of those. That's why harvest data is, in this instance, especially with unlimited quotas, tends to depict at least hunter interest more so than a population estimate where people might pick that apart.
Tony, on the POP2 model, do you use that?
No, we don't. Some states still do. Wyoming still uses POP2. We use a spreadsheet, a modified spreadsheet model, where we are able to put in survivorship values by gender and age class.
The POP2, you can get by putting the algorithms in, you can get any kind of results you want out of it by doing your own work on it. You know that.
Well, the reason we went away from the POP2 was because we couldn't get any result that we wanted. Actually, after 92, 93, where we had significant losses, the model didn't accommodate a die-off. We couldn't model that much of a decline in 1 year, and we had more flexibility with a spreadsheet model where you could assign survivorship values according to gender and age. It allowed us to model that event more accurately.
Thank you. Any other questions? Any commissioner? Thank you, Tony. Appreciate it. That was interesting. Anybody from the public have any? Let's go to the reports now. Information.